Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to this beautiful building and braving the cold this evening. My name's Sarah Del Monte. I am a member of Sister Salon. Sister Salon is the organisation that's hosting this event. We are a local grassroots feminist organisation. We work around a broad range of topics that affect women and girls, including consciousness-raising events. We have a monthly meeting, Sister Salon, here in Brighton. However, this event is not just a Sister Salon event. The original idea for this talk was Helen's, which I think, considering the fullness of the room and the size of the waiting list, is probably quite a good idea. Also, Kev, they always like to stand up, Kev. Thank you very much. Kev put in a huge amount of groundwork organising the original event in really quite a toxic and impossible situation. So thank you so much for doing that. We all share the values of being bold and creating the space for discussions that we want to have ourselves in a respectful and mature way. And we are so lucky to have these two courageous and tenacious journalists here to talk about the challenges of writing about contentious issues with integrity and compassion amidst this culture war. Helen Lewis is a staff writer for The Atlantic. She is also appears on the fortnightly Private Eye podcast. She hosts a BBC Radio 4 programme, New Gurus, and of course is the author of Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights. And with her is Hannah Barnes, who spent 15 years working for the BBC, specialising in analytical and investigative journalism, including investigations producer for Newsnight. She is also the author of Time to Think, the inside story of the collapse of the Tavistock Gender Service for Children, which is a Sunday Times bestseller, Orwell Prize nominee, and has been shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. She is also about to begin a new role of associate editor and staff writer with The New Statesman this month. So congrats, Hannah. As part of this event, Sister Salon has sent out a copy of Time to Think to every Brighton and Hove council member to try and encourage an informed and necessary discussion about the best way to support our city's children. The current council trans inclusion toolkit, although written with the best intentions, is now out of step with evidence-based practice around how to support children with trans identities. And following the CAS review and subsequent closure of the Tavistock clinic, it's our hope that going forward, we can support children in a more trauma-informed and evidence-based way. And I think Brighton is absolutely a place that should be leading this. So enough of my yakking. I'll let you two get on. All right, thank you all very much.
Bear with me, we're just going to do a slight, you might have to switch your microphone on as well, good. Hannah, I want to ask you, because I think this is often an interesting, and a moment, I'm sure lots of people in this room will have had a similar moment where they will have become interested in this subject, and perhaps it will have upended some assumptions that they had before. I mean, I think it certainly did to me as somebody who'd always seen themselves as a liberal and a feminist, but what was your first encounter with the material in the book?
Well, the first time I encountered the topic was 2017. So compared to some people in this room, I was a latecomer. And I'm, indebted to those that came before me.
I know, I'm like a grizzled Vietnam veteran. You don't know what 2017, you don't know you're born.
And I guess two things happened that year. So I was on maternity leave, and there was a documentary on the BBC about a clinic for young gender questioning kids in Canada, and it had been targeted by some people. The guy that ran it, a guy called Ken Zucker, was accused of carrying out conversion therapy. And it was very, very interesting in that you had different families in this documentary the experience of the children was very, very similar. They were very, very distressed around their gender identity, but they had very, very different outcomes. And I found the heat around it just quite baffling. And I think that was really my first experience of it. And then later that same year, Janice Turner wrote a piece, very long piece actually, in the Times. And it wasn't totally obvious at the time, but that actually included two clinicians speaking anonymously from GIDS, from the Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock. And I don't know whether it was because I'd had a daughter, but there was lots of stuff in there about, this switch to a large majority of the referrals to GIDS being girls and then being quite troubled and having difficult backgrounds and things like that. And that's how I first came across it, but I didn't do anything for another year or so.
Yeah, I think for me, particularly my encounter with the Tavistock, I'd written a couple of things about the Maria Miller's Women Inequalities inquiry, in which she only really heard from one side of with the argument. And I remember I was invited in by the Tavistock, and I can't remember now who it was. And they said, we want to kind of inform your reporting, which is, as a reporter, you should always do, right? You should always listen to as many sources as you can.
Sadly, that invitation was never extended to me.
Well, I doubt it would be extended to me now, but that was a point at the time in which they were trying to do a kind of certain level of outreach, I guess. I think it was probably earlier than 2017. And the one thing that they did convey, which I think your book conveys as well, is that we are talking about kids who are often really complicated mental health problems, really desperate situations. Their parents are desperate to help them. They just want, as anyone would, want to make their kid happy again. And to convey that. And I'm afraid it had exactly the opposite effect on me than I think it was intended, because I thought this is how there are two types of medical scandals. There is playing God arrogance, and you see that, for example, perhaps in the Ian Patterson scandal. And then there is saviorism, and we have the answer. And that is the story of lobotomies for epilepsy, for example, or whatever it might be. There is a real problem there, and hang on a minute, thank God we're the ones who found the answer. And the one thing that I can remember now that I asked them was, and I think that some of the spike in girls had already happened, are you not even slightly worried that this is this generation's anorexia? And I remember that it was like no one had ever put this question to them before, that they just completely stonewalled me on it. There was no acknowledgement that actually sometimes if children, particularly girls, presented in incredible distress with their bodies, we had seen this happen before and had a completely different approach to it, and that was worth thinking why this time we were going to treat it in an affirmative way rather than anorexia treatment. And I was like, how is this not something that you have a ready answer to?
Well, I think it's interesting because you mentioned the Maria Miller inquiry, and actually Bernadette Wren, who was I suppose the number 2 at GIDS, gave evidence to that inquiry, sitting next to Susie Green from Mermaids. And both Bernadette Wren's oral evidence and some written evidence that they'd supplied was absolutely extraordinary. And there really wasn't, at that point, any attempt to hide what they were doing at all. They were open about it. And actually they'd said, in terms of the evidence base, actually we're not following the small evidence that there is for some people. We've decided to extend it to kids in care, kids struggling with all kinds of other difficulties, neurodiverse children, because we think we shouldn't withhold this really beneficial treatment. But they acknowledged that the children for whom allegedly there was some kind of evidence base from the Dutch team, those weren't the kids that they were seeing. So they were applying an evidence base which I would argue is weak to start with to a completely different cohort of children, and they were open about it. And even more extraordinary really was that the response from most of that committee, cross-party committee of MPs, was, why are you so cautious?
Yeah, but it was kind of, you've got the answer, why are you being so slow in dispensing it to these people who need it? Which I think is quite extraordinary, because I imagine most of us acknowledge that. I remember having a conversation very early on with a male friend who wasn't particularly interested in the subject, and he said, I can't see why people aren't more questioning about whether or not what the cost-benefit analysis is. He said, chemotherapy, an incredible treatment for cancer, has absolutely revolutionised, saved loads of lives that have not been saved, but it has got really grim and horrible side effects, and actually for some people they might decide that they don't want to do it. It might be inappropriate for some types of cancers. These are the conversations that in any other type of treatment would be completely legitimate to say, we've got this treatment, here are what we think the benefits are, here are what we think the costs are, let's put those to people. And why did that piece not happen here?
Well, they didn't attempt to find what the costs and benefits might be. I mean, they were actually very cautious for a long time, and there was this approach, which is known as the Dutch protocol, which, in a nutshell, puberty blockers, then at 12, now even younger, but at the onset of puberty, followed by hormones at around 16, and then surgery. It started in the Netherlands, and then there was pressure here to do it. And actually they resisted it for quite a long time, and they said, well, we're not sure, because we're really worried about what impact that might have, blocking so early on young people's brain development, on the development of their gender identity. This is a really important time. So we're not sure, and we've only got this actually pretty small group from the Netherlands. So what they came up with was the right answer, but then they just did it in an appalling way. But the right answer was, well, we need to get more information, so we'll do our own study. And then they rejected suggestions that for a study design which would have allowed them to actually have some conclusions that would indicate whether it was the blockers or not, and they rejected those. But the staggering thing is there was just no attempt to follow evidence-based medicine at all, because when that dictates that when you get findings back that they're not consistent with what you thought before, then you change direction, and that just didn't happen. So I think that the original move was understandable and well-intentioned, and what is really difficult to understand, and I can't explain it, is why, when the evidence came back that the blockers weren't performing in the way that they thought, that they really weren't providing time to think because everybody thought in the same way, and they weren't making many of these young people feel better either. Many got worse, many just were the same. Why that didn't lead to a change in direction?
I mean, let me throw out a couple of things and you can tell me whether or not you think they're relevant. One is, I think, the possibility of a sunk cost fallacy, or maybe not quite exactly that, but the idea that you become so attached to something that you simply cannot reject it. And I think I've been thinking a lot about this in light of the post office scandal that's been playing out. And a similar thing happened there, which is that the problems with that computer system were known very early on, and people lied to themselves and then lied to other people about them because they couldn't accept the enormity of what they would have to concede if they said, actually, you know, we've done this terrible, you know, we've been prosecuting people on the basis of a computer system that was faulty and we said it wasn't. And I wonder if there was some of that people simply had invested their whole lives and their identities in being good people in the Tavistock, helping kids. And they couldn't psychically grasp the idea that some of these interventions may not have been as useful as they thought.
I think as time went on, that definitely helps to explain it, because, you know, some of the people and who are still leading that service have worked in the field for, what now, coming up for 20 years. And I think as a human being, it's kind of intolerable, isn't it, to think, what if I got it wrong for so many people? Not all, like, you know, absolutely not all, but it's quite intolerable to think that you might have harmed particularly children. And I think, you know, that the reason I think many of the people that spoke to me for the book are so brave is that you know, quite a few of those clinicians put their name to it and said, I've made terrible mistakes and I feel terrible about it, and I'll put my name to it. Because many of us wouldn't do that.
No,
it's really hard to admit that you're wrong, especially if it means that you might have harmed people in the process.
Yeah, I mean, I think very, people like to think that they would have been the one person who stands up and sacrifices everything. And the reality is the vast majority of us do not do that. Whistleblowers are generally pretty unusual people. The next thing I want to ask is about activist involvement in drawing up the guidelines, and whether or not there was an inappropriate relationship, and why were, for example, organisations like Mermaids sort of allowed to mark the homework of a clinical service. I don't think that they shouldn't have been consulted as an interest group, but they went way beyond that, their involvement in the service, I would say.
Well, it was confirmed, wasn't it, in the recent dump of data that obviously the Tavistock didn't have, but then they did find 300 pages of it when forced to hand it over. You know, correspondence between Mermaids and them, that Susie Green had been involved with the drafting of the service specification, which basically, well, it came in 2016, the new one, which had lowered the age of the blockers and everything. But so were GIRS. So, I mean, Mermaids get all the attention, but they weren't the only group by any means. And certainly in those early years, another group called GIRS, which is the
Gender Identity
Research and
Education Support. Yeah, okay.
That one. Yeah. Sorry. Yes.
Sorry, that was Jane Clare Jones telling us it was started by Press for Change, which is Stephen Whittle's pressure group. Yeah.
So they were very involved, and actually it never made the Telegraph and stuff, but for the geeks that go through that data dump, it's quite extraordinary that gyres and mermaids and one of the Liberal Democrat peers is sort of acting as a go-between between them and then the chair of the Tavistock, not GIDS, like the whole of the Tavistock Trust. It's sort of quite extraordinary. But so they were involved. Now, stakeholders, as you say, should be involved. It's how much they're listened to, and it's not entirely clear what influence they had over the service specification. And I think the role of the groups is a bit more nuanced than people perhaps think it is. So they were absolutely in clinicians' minds all the time, particularly mermaids as time went on, and then more latterly gendered intelligence, who became the most influential in the most recent years. But it's not entirely clear whether they sort of directly influence clinical decisions. But they were in people's minds, and certainly they were talked about a lot. I mean, there's a paper trail that shows that, and yes, Susie Green was allowed to directly refer to the Tavistock. We've known that for a long time, but so were many other groups. So were All Sorts here in Brighton, and they still do and have done very recently, because they were allowed to. So I think
also that mermaids get such outside attention because Susie Green has got such a compelling story. And for those of you who don't know, I imagine most of you do, her story was that she's got a trans daughter, Jackie, whom she took to Thailand at 16 for surgery, because at the time you needed to be 18. And Jackie's now very happily and successful. And it was essentially the fairy tale version of gender reassignment, which is that I had a kid who was really unhappy, went through this process and came out the other side, and everything is really perfect. And I think that was a very compelling life story.
Well,
it was. But if you imagine, if you have a parent of a really distressed child, what you want to hear is, it's all going to be okay. And Susie Green was the kind of living proof of that.
Yes, but I think the difficulty was that Susie Green obviously has the views that she has, and they're very understandable given the path her family has taken. But what Susie Green is not is a clinician. So she's obviously entitled to her opinion, but it's not a medical opinion. I mean, many people in this room will have children, including myself. I don't claim to be an expert on raising children. I mean, it's just because something has happened to you, it doesn't mean that you're an expert at it. So But there was a difference in it. I mean, certainly, one clinician said we were absolutely answering to mermaids, and I think up at the Leeds site that was probably more the case because they were based there, and people were very aware of them, and demands were made, and clinicians would be switched if Susie Green complained. So they were obviously influential. Whether they actually changed things on a grand scale, it's much more difficult to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most shocking things that I found in your book is, forgive me if I'm getting his name wrong, but there's a surgeon called James Bellringer who has been doing gender reassignment surgery for decades, mostly on trans women, so constructing vaginas. So this is not by any means somebody who is either a transphobe or not on board with the project of people identifying and changing their body medically if they so wish. And he goes to the Tavistock and says, these kids you're sending to me who've been on puberty blockers simply do not have enough tissue in order to be able to give them functioning genitalia. And they just sort of fob him off, as far as I remember.
That's what happened. So he goes to speak to the staff and he says, look, there's this danger. And at that point, there were lots more examples from the Netherlands because they'd started earlier. And something like 80% of the young trans women who'd started as male, who'd been blocked in the early stages, probably Tanner stage 2 and 3, but had to have a more risky type of surgery. So if there isn't enough penile tissue, if you're blocked earlier in puberty, then there was an alternative technique that had to be used where you'd use a bit of the bowel, which was both riskier and less successful, and might mean that there'd be further surgery down the line. And James Bellringer goes along and he talks to the staff team at GIDS and explains that this is an issue. And it's not actually particularly controversial now that it is an issue. I mean, Marcy Bowers, who was Jazz Jennings' surgeon in the States, and she's now head of WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare, she is open about this being an issue, that if you block puberty too early in biological males, then this can be a problem. So he goes along, he explains this. Now, everybody listening to that says, that's really quite important information, and we should be telling the relevant families that, not to either encourage or discourage them, but because they need to know that in order to provide informed consent. So one of the clinicians, Melissa Midgen, she draws up essentially an information leaflet to provide to the relevant families. And it's signed off by James Bellringer for accuracy, and it's signed off by Bernadette Wren, and she can't get approval for it to be given out to families from Polly Carmichael. And so 6 months later, she writes
director
again,
of the service.
Who's director of the service since 2009 and still is, and contrary to some people, it is still open today. And so 6 months later, she says, well, you know, Polly, colleagues are talking to me about this. It'd be really helpful to have something concrete that we can talk to families about. There's no response. And it's not till 2019. So they have this talk in November 2016, and it's not until 2019, May, I believe, from memory, that this is all codified and spoken about with the relevant families. And then actually, I believe, in the endocrinology clinics, once the kind of decision has already been made.
You say that Marcy Bowers has been quite open about that. My recollection of it...
she was, and then she wasn't.
Right, is that there's a Zoom meeting where she talks about it, and she says if you are puberty blocked before, I think it's Tanner stage 2, you will likely never achieve an orgasm as an adult. So we're asking people to go, you know, this will relieve their gender dysphoria, but they will just simply not sexually develop enough to ever be fertile, they can't bank any sperm, and also as an adult they will never have a climax. And people kind of, I think, ran around with their hair on fire, and she really walked that back as far as I can.
Well, it was really interesting. So she made that comment at this kind of forum at Duke University, and some of the most gender-affirming clinicians in the States were also in it. And in the same meeting, which is incredibly long, but, you know, she says, oh, you know, we're talking about this and people are actually changing practice. You know, we're maybe saying, look, just wait a bit longer. But yes, I mean, and then, but you know, when she's talking to the press, there's no issue here. It's disappointing because I think, I know, you know, obviously people in this room will have different views, but if people want to transition, they must be given all of the information that is available. You know, both the potential benefits and the potential risks. It's just not, it's dishonest, and how can you give informed consent? I mean, it's just wrong.
And I think for a long time, there wasn't an acknowledgement about the literature on desistance and the fact that even quite severely gender dysphoric children, the majority of them, if allowed to go through natal puberty, then didn't want to continue with treatment, which was accepted for a long time, that actually if you saw people as adults, they'd had a long time to think about this. And that, I think it's mentioned in the Cass report, the idea that puberty in some respects is itself a kind of really transformative process that for some people not maybe doesn't resolve their gender dysphoria, but dials it down to a situation in which they're happy to be a very butch woman or a very effeminate man. And that's enough, that's far enough for them. And I think maybe were people not getting that information either, or maybe that information simply wasn't available in the 2000s and early 2010s.
It was available. I mean, it's debated. You know, some trans groups kind of question those statistics, and you know, the one that's often cited is 80%. Now, I think what you can say with certainty is all of the studies that were done in the past are all rubbish, as are the present ones. But there was a consistent pattern, which is you took a group of children who had gender-related distress. Some would transition as adults. That distress would continue, and some wouldn't. And it was the latter group that was the largest, consistently. Whether it's 80% or 70%, you know, different studies showed different things. And of those that didn't transition, which were the majority of them would grow up to be gay men and lesbian women. And that was a consistent finding. And certainly, yeah, that wasn't shared en masse. It was like all the knowledge of the past just was forgotten as the service got busier and busier. And I don't think it was willful. I didn't see any evidence of that, but they didn't have time to think.
Right, which is the other meaning of the title. And that was the other thing I did want to ask you about, was about this idea that just the workload increased. I mean, we're talking multiple 1,000% spikes in referrals over particular periods, and the composition of who's attending those clinics changing from being predominantly natal males to predominantly natal females. How much of this is a story about ideology, and how much of it is a story about simple NHS resource crunches?
It is a story about NHS resources, and actually it's a story in part about the chronic underfunding of youth mental health services. Because one of the problems, which wasn't GIDS's fault at all, was the dire state that CAMS, like child and adolescent mental health services, were in, and they would offload their children onto this special national service that they thought was really well funded, and you'd get children with very, very complex lives, multiple difficulties, but at the drop of the word gender, they would be offloaded from CAMS to GIDS, where those other difficulties that they were contending with weren't dealt with at all, because they saw themselves as a gender service. But I think it's more than both the resources and an ideological thing. It's a story of incredibly weak leadership on every single level, of a complete lack of oversight from NHS England, of cover-up, of denial, cultural malaise, scapegoating whistleblowers, and a complete lack of evidence-based medicine. It's all those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty comprehensive systematic failure. So let's talk about what changed it. I mean, it's interesting you said it, because I was just I did a women's hour. I remember after women's hour, I did avoiding this topic for a really long time. Then Jenny Murray wrote a piece for the Sunday Times saying, live your life as you want, just don't call yourself a woman, which I think caused something of an internal meltdown at the BBC. She was then banned from hosting any discussions on the topic. Women's Hour finally, I think in about 2018, decided that it was going to tackle this. And I was up to talk about the toxic media environment with Beck Stinson, who was Stonewall's head of trans inclusion. And I remember mentioning about the extremely high incidence of autism in gender dysphoric kids, and people sort of clutched their pearls. I mean, this was, barely 5 years ago. People were still saying, how could you say anything to do with a developmental disorder?
But even that year, there was a paper from the Tavistock that said 35% of our referrals.
Yeah, and for me, covering this whole subject has been a really kind of brutal insight into how most people go for their politics on kind of essentially vibes and memes. Well, no, but I'm sure if any of you have talked about this subject online, and I, you've got this incredible depth of knowledge. I've got a kind of layperson's level of knowledge from having kind of covered it at more of a distance. But people will just regurgitate these zombie statistics or zombie facts at you, and they've been, by this point, extensively debunked. But the memo has not reached people at all. And I felt that was probably the case about the idea that, as you say, that the profile of people had really switched, and that we were looking at natal females with loads more complicated histories, eating disorders, autism, trauma, whatever it might be. And that memo really didn't get people, and people just kept wheeling out that bloody graph about left-handedness. Which is one way of looking at the statistics, that there was this latent population that had never been identified before, and that now finally, in the case of left-handedness, actively repressed, and that this was kind of coming out. And if that was true, the interesting thing to me about that was why the gender flipped on it, and why was the presentation so different? What was described as Lisa Lippman as rapid onset. I know that's a very controversial term, but these were certainly a different cohort, as you said, to the kind of kids in the Dutch protocol who had often had persistent gender dysphoria since early childhood. And also, why was it happening in kind of clusters among teenage girls, who we know are the one group that is most prone to whatever you want to call it? I would call it social contagion. And those questions were just sort of weirdly taboo. And people go, but let me show you the left-handedness graph. Have you considered this? That was, to me, was kind of, I think has been as I covering this subject has sort of diminished my respect for quite a lot of people who I previously would have respected.
It's weird.
It's true though, isn't it? You just think, but have you not looked into it? And you assume naively, you'll look into it and you'll look at the evidence, and then you'll see that it's actually quite complicated, and then people just don't. They keep just sending you the same three things.
Well, it's like there's the suicide statistics as well, which have been, even by the person that's quoted as making the statistics, said, no, I didn't really say that, and you can't say that. So, yeah. I mean, it's weird, because I think...
And that, I have to say, I think that's one of the most egregious things. I remember I published a piece by Sarah Dighton about a young trans kid who had left a suicide note and then walked in front of a truck. This was in America. And there was a whole sort of kind of, I'm going to say it now, I think it was a very mawkish, weird appropriation, a sort of reminiscent of the death of Princess Diana, of kind of turning this person into our martyred saint and publishing the suicide note. And yeah, exactly. And if, it's one of those things where you make yourself unpopular by being consistent with your principles. The Samaritans are really clear. Yeah. Do not publish the contents of suicide notes. Do not attribute suicides to a single cause. Do not make people think, I'll commit suicide and then I'll show them, then they'll understand. And actually they say don't say commit suicide, say kill yourself, because it's not a criminal act anymore. But it was all of this stuff that I thought we all knew and had agreed on.
Well, I think it
got chucked out the window.
It's because gender's experienced this exceptionalism in all aspects of society. So as you say, as journalists, we're told to speak about suicide incredibly carefully. And, rightly, we're told off for, to make it sound babyish. But when you get it wrong,
but also that is
get in trouble, which is good.
It's been really, really important. So the number of suicides on the tube and train network has dramatically declined since they stopped being routinely reported. And that's simply because people who are, in a phase of suicidal ideation, if you then provide them, if you go, do you know what's a really great way to kill yourself? It's this. That is the kind of information you should absolutely not give to somebody at that point. And so one of the things I found is people who ostensibly had the welfare of these young people at their heart were preaching the kind of, this person killed themselves and then they'll see, then they'll be sorry, then the transphobic parents will know, they'll rue the day that they ever did this. And I just found that was appalling.
It is appalling, but I think there's two things. So one is this idea of exceptionalism. So it's an area that's not treated the same as any other. So in medical circles, Hilary Cass has said in her interim review, there hasn't been the level of oversight we'd expect in any other medical field that is using a relatively new treatment for a condition that it's, not been designed for. Where have the politicians been? Journalists generally have been pretty useless. We don't talk about it in the same, you mentioned suicide there, but just generally the scrutiny hasn't been there. And several clinicians just said, well, it's like gender creates this kind of cloak of mystery and no one asks the questions. These young people weren't treated how other young people are treated in any other services. Like everything that we know about adolescence and childhood development just suddenly went out the window because we're talking about gender. But the other thing, one area that actually GIDS was very responsible at was dismissing the suicide narrative. And they did, recently, it bizarrely is crept in, but for many, many years, consistently, to their credit actually, both Polly Carmichael, Bernadette Rent said, and it's on there, I think it's still on their website now. Suicide is thankfully rare. We don't see it very often. It happens, but it happens in young troubled people, sadly. Now, any death of a young person is tragic. It's appalling. But there isn't this epidemic, thankfully, of young trans people taking their own lives. And actually, what message does that send to any young person that this difficulty that you're facing is so awful that you can't confront it? You have to kill yourself. It's no way to help that young person whatsoever. So
I think it's also a big difference between Europe and America, because I would say that the activist doctors in America,
they actually said it.
They do actually. I think there's a Jack Turbin paper is pretty explicit about here are the mental health outcomes of, and that kind of, there was a while where you did have that, would you rather have a dead son or a living daughter, was a thing that you did genuinely hear, which is tantamount to sort of emotional blackmail for people who are trying to slow down and kind of consider their options. Well, let me just, we'll open to questions in a minute, but let me ask a couple of things about the kind of post-life of the book, which is, one, I'm really interested. You talked to lots of people in that book, actually, who were happy with the treatment they received at GIDS. And they felt it was the right thing to have done, to have gone through it. How did you go about reporting those stories which were, and setting that stuff alongside the evidence that you found of really sloppy clinical work?
Well, the same way that I did for anybody else that I spoke to. I mean, I listened to what they had to say, and they were all very generous with their time, and they shared paperwork with me and very intimate and personal details, for which I'm enormously grateful. And I let them tell their stories in their words. I mean, it didn't surprise me that people were happy with it, because if everybody was unhappy, then this wouldn't have ever happened, would it? If it was so obvious and every single clinician went, God, what the am I doing? Then it wouldn't happen. I mean, and interestingly, there are. It's not that those that are still, still identify as trans are the happy ones, and those that don't are the unhappy ones. There's a real mix, and I think, one of my friends laughs about this, that most of my answers are always, oh, it's a bit complicated. So sorry, that makes me very boring. But it is kind of true. So I mean, I think if you take this, taking aside the very complicated case where a mum who I call Diana in the book, and her son Alex, who's very mentally unwell, I think there's kind of three happy ones, if you like, and three unhappy. But of the happy, you've got Ellie, who was at the service prior to puberty blockers, really. And, had they been available, I have no doubt in my mind, nor does she now, that she would have become a trans man. And she found it amazingly helpful to be able to talk to someone about how she was feeling. She, I guess in modern parlance, she was socially transitioned, and it was really helpful. And she spoke to Domenico Taccioli, who was the founder of the service, who was really honest about what transition would entail, and said, well, why do you feel that your body's not a girl's body and there are different girls' bodies? And so she was really happy, and she didn't transition. And on the flip side, there's a young man in there called Jacob, who's still trans. He's 21, coming up for 22 now. But he had a dreadful time, because he said, he was very, very poorly well on puberty blockers for 4 years, broke 4 bones, and no one has ever followed up with him since. And this is there's no intellectual curiosity, even if you don't think you have any pastoral duty to that young person. So few people come off puberty blockers. You'd think it's just really interesting and helpful on a medical level.
I remember
to follow up this person and check how they're doing.
I remember covering the Kira Bell case. I went down to the Royal Courts of Justice when she got that judgment handed down, and reading through that judgment and discussing it with people. And I said, I think this has done 2 really incredible things. The first is that you have judges on record saying we think this is an experimental treatment, which bust open the kind of, it's just a pause button, it's totally reversible. And, the NHS had already begun to kind of revise its guidance already. But these were people saying, no, it's an experimental procedure, and therefore we should really be collecting good data on it. You have to prove that this is a good treatment. And then the other bit was that bit of, around the same time, data that came out that the Tavistock finally coughed up the number of people. They said, who has ever been on, what percentage of people you put on puberty blockers go on to transition? And they went, all of them. And it was that point, again, it bust open this kind of, it's a neutral pause button. It said, it's the first ticket on a train that has got only one destination, essentially. And so I think you're right. I think the lack of curiosity about the people who did end up desisting after that. And the Atlantic, we ran a piece by a trans man called Kinnan McKinnon that said, we need to pay more attention to detransitioners. They are completely ostracised in many parts of the trans community, as if they've somehow kind of let the side down. But actually, those people's experiences are a part of this community too. And actually, there are probably really interesting things we could learn from them if we were in this. Anyway, you will never guess the fact that was not a warmly received piece.
So, and I've spoken to Kinnan, and he's fantastic. And actually, learning what doesn't work for some people is equally as helpful as learning what does help for others. And actually, you end up with better healthcare for everybody. But I think the Kira Bell case, so they hadn't changed any. I mean, the guidance really still hasn't changed. We're in this sort of weird limbo now, where the old.
But they changed from totally reversible, didn't they? That was originally language that was used on the site. And
that came out in the May. NHS, but it wasn't guidance. It was just acknowledgement that they just said we don't know. But I think that case was a game changer because it didn't really matter that it lost on appeal, because what it did was it absolutely smashed it into the open. I mean, you'd been reporting on it and we'd done a couple of Newsnight things by then, but the whole of the world's media was there. I mean, I sat in court for the 2 days of the hearing, and it was quite kind of astonishing, and it was sort of in that weird hybrid COVID thing. And in the typically understated British way, the judge is saying, I think on 3 occasions, that they were surprised, as in, what the actual that this clinic had not really collected any, seemingly meaningful data in 30 years on a really powerful, whether you want to call it experimental is kind of irrelevant, medication, clinical pathway, and they knew nothing about it. They didn't know how many they'd put forward, or if they did, they didn't want to say. They didn't know what sex they were, how old they were, if they'd gone on to take hormones, where they'd gone afterwards. They literally knew nothing or weren't prepared to say it. So either way, it's pretty bad. And I also think, like, Kira Bell being brave enough to put herself in the public domain showed people that actually, while of course lots of people were happy and are happy as transitioned adults, not everybody was. And that transitioning as a child had absolutely not worked. And when you read about the circumstances under which that she was being seen at GIDS, she wasn't even living with her parents, and I think it's really easy to talk about harms but without any person to put it onto, it's not really very tangible. I mean, it's like why journalists love case studies, because
you can sympathise with the person. It's very hard to care about a system. Yeah, I mean, again, I've been thinking about this in the post office drama. I don't know if any of you've seen the ITV one, but they do a very clever thing in the first episode, which is that they show you the blinking lights of the Horizon computer system. I was talking to the producers today who said we did think of it like HAL in, Space Odyssey. And I thought that's a really smart thing to do, because so many of the problems of modern life are essentially like faceless bureaucracy, computer says no. And to some extent, that is how the Tavistock ended up functioning, was that you just encountered this wall of people. The clinicians, might see you a couple of months apart, and they had to, the caseloads were huge, so they didn't have that kind of individual level of ability to connect with the patient in front of them. They were trying to swat up. And again, it is just that kind of a sense of this has happened to 1,000 people, and well, hang on a minute, but what has happened? And I think your book with the case studies does that very well, of saying, like, here are the range of experiences that people went through.
Well, people got different experiences because they had different clinicians as well. Yeah. So I think it's really important, like, some young people did receive really good care because they had good clinicians, and the problem was there was no consistency. So any given young person and their family turning up might have an assessment that would be 3 sessions long, and then a decision could be made that they went forward for physical interventions. Or they might have an assessment with a really thoughtful clinician. I mean, this is more so in the earlier, 5-6 years ago, before the mass exodus of the cautious clinicians. But you could have 30 sessions. Now, at the end of that, so that could be several years, right? At the end of that, if that young person and their family then make the decision together that they want to transition, having explored everything in their life, and they still feel, with all the information, with that James Bell ringer, because some clinicians did pass it on, it just wasn't uniform, then one could argue that is a decision for them. But that is very different, and some wouldn't. Some would go, actually, you know what, I'm all right. So, but that is a very different experience.
To a much more affirmative clinician. Yeah, well, I think that's a good point. We should turn it over to questions.